It was 1898, and a farmer living near Kensington, Minnesota, named Olaf Ullman, was grubbing out a tree stump with his son when he made a very surprising discovery. Tangled in the root system of a poplar tree was a curious rectangular slab of sandstone. Upon closer inspection, the stone seemed to be covered in strange markings that had clearly been engraved by a human hand. After hauling the 30-inch tall and 16-inch wide stone from the ground, Olaf realized that he had found something truly remarkable. But what exactly was it? He would later tell curious journalists that at first he assumed that it must be what he called a quote-unquote Indian almanac, some sort of calendar produced by Minnesota's first people. But very quickly it was determined that the markings had the look of medieval Norse runes. Could this have been an artifact left behind by some forgotten group of Norse adventurers? Soon it was determined that the markings were indeed part of a legible runic system that could be translated. When transcribed in English, the inscription read, quote, 8 Gotlanders, that is ancient Swedes, and 22 Norwegians on this exploration journey from Vinland to the far west. We had a camp by 2 skerries, or potentially 2 shelters, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 men red from blood and dead. Ave Maria, save from evil. There are 10 men by the sea to look after our ships, 14 days' journey from this peninsula. Year 1362. End quote. Everything about this artifact that became popularly known as the Kensington Rune Stone was very curious. If it was authentic, then who were this band of Norse explorers pushing west into America's interior in the year 1362? The events of the Icelandic Vinland Sagas were usually dated to around the year 1000. Even if the Icelandic Sagas contained a distant historical memory of the Norse settlement of the Americas, those settlements were far further east and had only lasted a handful of years. By 1362, Vinland was becoming something close to a myth. How did the Kensington runestone fit within this narrative? A few obscure historical documents seem to offer some clues. One 17th century Icelandic church historian claimed in his history of Norse Arctic explorations that around the 1340s, a group of Greenlanders started to abandon Christianity and revived the worship of the old Nordic gods. Could it have been that this group of renegade pagan Greenlanders left their home colony and traveled west back towards the long-abandoned Vinland colony? What's more, records from medieval Sweden tell us that in the year 1354, King Magnus Eriksson commanded a law officer named Paul Knutsson to travel to Greenland to determine whether or not the Greenlanders had indeed abandoned the faith. So, perhaps, Paul Knutsson and his entourage arrived in Greenland sometime in the mid-1350s and discovered that this group of pagan renegades had indeed pulled up stakes and headed west. Then, maybe, Knutsson decided to track these Greenlanders down. Is it possible that Knutsson's chase took him all the way through the Great Lakes to the westernmost point of Lake Superior, where his group parked their longships and then hiked inland some 200 miles before ending their hunt in Kensington, Minnesota? Was the Kensington runestone meant as a grave marker for the fallen comrades that the inscription described? Was this piece of sandstone actually the last known account of a long-forgotten hunt for Odin-worshipping Greenlanders? If that was in fact the case, then it is a wild historical coincidence that the Kensington runestone was found by Olof Åman, a Swedish immigrant living in a part of Minnesota that in the 19th century had become a popular destination for many Swedish and Norwegian immigrants. For this stone to be carved by Swedes and Norwegians and then lay undisturbed for centuries only to be found by a Swede, well, what were the odds? Beyond that, what were the odds that that Swedish discoverer would also be a trained stonemason who was obsessed with history and had at least a passing interest in runic writing systems? Quite a coincidence. If the Kensington runestone was authentic, then it suggested that a growing community of Scandinavians had coincidentally gravitated to a part of the United States that, unbeknownst to them, had been visited by their Norse ancestors centuries earlier. But however improbable these coincidences may be, the Kensington runestone remains one of the most debated Norse-flavored artifacts ever found in North America. The runestone found an early champion in the Norwegian-American historian Hjalmar Holland, who managed to obtain the stone from the farmer Olof Åman in 1907. Holland became absolutely convinced of the stone's authenticity and set about determining the correct historical context for its creation. It was Holland who zeroed in on these scraps of historical evidence concerning Paul Knutsen's potential expedition. Interestingly, Holland proposed that this group of Norse explorers did not get to Minnesota by way of the Great Lakes, as he assumed that Niagara Falls would have been an impassable natural obstacle. Instead, he proposed that they took an Arctic route around Labrador and then south into Hudson's Bay, where they eventually entered the Nelson River, which they then followed south to Lake Winnipeg, and eventually on into the Red River. This somewhat unlikely hypothesis eventually found added support from a geologist named Newton Horace Winchell, who was working under the auspices of Minnesota's Historical Society. Now, the fact that these two well-known academics vouched for the authenticity of the Kensington runestone did much to raise its profile. It helped that there were many Minnesotans with Scandinavian heritage who liked the story that the Kensington runestone told about their adopted home. The stone's authenticity became a matter of Scandinavian immigrant pride. Despite that, from the outset, there were many who were skeptical of the Kensington runestone, and over the decades, the skeptics have become the majority. Holland's hypothesis about Knutsen's journey has not stood up well to scrutiny. Further historical research has demonstrated that there's good reason to believe that because of political turmoil in Scandinavia in the mid-14th century, Knutsen never actually set sail for Greenland in the first place. There are also many things about the stone itself that are suspicious. In 1899, a researcher from Northwestern University pointed out that the inscriptions on the stone were not nearly as weathered as they should be if they had been carved in the 1300s. Then there are the runes, which are a little unusual. While many of the runes on the Kensington runestone are consistent with medieval runes used in the 1300s, there are many irregularities as well. First, the language used on the stone is neither medieval Norse nor medieval Swedish, and instead reads like a combination of the two. The grammar used is remarkably close to 19th century Swedish grammar than it is to either medieval language. When the Kensington runestone was examined in Sweden in 2004, researchers determined that many of the more eccentric symbols on the stone were consistent with a runic alphabet that was developed in the 1800s and was used in Sweden by journeyman tailors. Notably, the region in Sweden where this modern runic system was most popular is the same region where the humble farmer Olof Åman was born. The scholarly consensus is now overwhelmingly that the Kensington runestone was a 19th century forgery. The forger was probably the farmer Olof Åman, but it may have potentially been one of his neighbors, a fellow Swede looking to dupe the hapless Åman. We now have over 100 years of scholarship on this stone, and time again, experts identify elements on the Kensington runestone that make it very clear that it could not have been created before the mid-1800s. But despite that, there remains a community of true believers that insist on the Kensington runestone's authenticity. I would suggest that, like those enthusiastic 19th century Scandinavian immigrants, these Kensington diehards are drawn to this artifact because they like the story it tells about American history. This makes them part of a long and storied tradition in the United States and Canada. You see, starting in the early 19th century, the work of a handful of authors helped ignite a wave of interest in the previously obscure Icelandic Sagas. For the first time, many English speakers were introduced to the stories about Vinland found in the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. This literary evidence convinced many that the Norse had arrived in North America centuries before Columbus. The only problem was that in the 19th century, there wasn't any physical evidence to back this up. This led to a wave of sketchy archaeology that hoped to confirm a Viking presence in places as diverse as Rhode Island, Minnesota, Brooklyn, New York, and Oklahoma. As the case for early Norse contact became better known, it birthed a ton of amateur historical speculation. New and unproven historical theories can sometimes be hijacked and shaped to fit all sorts of ideological narratives. Viking contact could be used to raise the historic profile of one's home state or city, or it could be used to justify the presence of a newly arrived immigrant group. But the evidence for an early Norse arrival could also be bent to serve more sinister purposes. When looked at from a particular angle, the American Vikings could be used to justify a racist and exclusionary agenda. Scraps of evidence from the sagas could be twisted into pseudo-historical narratives that sought to replace North America's true first people with a lost group of light-skinned Europeans. North America has a real Viking history, but fake Viking history has been getting in its way for generations. Let's see if we can figure out which is which today on Our Fake History. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, this is just another quick reminder that an ad-free version of this show is available to those supporting at $5 or more through Patreon. When you become a patron, you get access to a ton of extra episodes, including the upcoming extra on the 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. You also become one of the beautiful people that keeps this podcast running. So, if you've been digging the show, the best way to show your support and get some goodies in the process is to go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and find a level of support that works for you. This week, we are wrapping up our look at the Viking voyages to North America. As you've hopefully already gathered, this is part 3 in a trilogy of episodes on this topic. If you've not heard the first 2 parts, then I strongly suggest that you go back and give them a listen now. In the previous installments, I spent some time giving some context about the so-called Viking Age and busting some oft-repeated historical myths about the medieval Norse. Then we dove into the remarkable Icelandic texts known as the Sagas to see what clues they might hold concerning the extent of the Viking voyages. We learned that the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red described 3 distinct geographical areas visited by the Norse west of Greenland: Helluland, or rock slab land, Markland, or forest land, and Vinland, the land of wine. The Saga of Eric the Red got even more specific, describing 2 Vinland settlements, a northern settlement called Stromfjord, and a more southerly settlement called Hope. According to that saga, Hope was the part of Vinland that was mild and was home to wild grapes. But as you heard, the sagas are famously difficult to parse as historical texts. Some parts of the sagas describe very believable interactions between the Norse and the first people of Vinland, who the Norse called the Skrælings. Those descriptions align quite closely with contact narratives from later centuries, which suggests that the sagas are, in fact, the earliest texts we have that describe a meeting between indigenous North Americans and European visitors. These stories also suggest that the Vinland settlement was so short-lived because of the violent tensions with the local people. Along the way, I spent some time breaking down some of the wilder moments in the sagas, and hopefully illuminated their wider context, which, as we said, has more to do with the history of Iceland and the families that lived there than the history of North America. Today, I'm hoping to bring all of our threads together. First, I want to look at how the concept of American Vikings was first introduced to the English-speaking world in the 19th century. What started as a novel historical theory based on a close reading of the sagas soon found an eager audience. This created a small cottage industry of fake Viking history that involved a motley collection of forged or misinterpreted archaeological objects and fantasies about light-skinned European Americans that somehow predated the continent's true indigenous people. After we spend some time examining these imagined Vikings, I want to get back to the real Vikings and look at where the evidence in the sagas and the best archaeology overlaps. Hopefully, by the end of today's episode, we can make an educated guess about exactly how far into the North American continent the Norse managed to voyage. But let's start by heading to the early 1800s and talking about the work of the Danish historian Carl Christian Rafn. Rafn was instrumental in shining a light on the very real Norse presence in North America, but he also helped give birth to a generation's worth of historical misconceptions. How did that happen? Well, let's talk about it. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Rosetta Stone. Are any of you out there planning to travel this year? I know at least a few of you are. Well, imagine going into that trip actually understanding the language. Rosetta Stone helps you feel more confident, more connected, and way less like a tourist. Rosetta Stone has been the trusted leader in language learning for over 30 years. Their immersive, intuitive method helps you truly pick up your new language naturally. No memorizing random vocabulary lists, no feeling lost. Now, as you've probably heard, I'm going to Greece this year with a bunch of listeners. And before I go, I'm going to try and learn some Greek with Rosetta Stone. I'm also pumped to use their true accent feature to really get my pronunciations locked down. Don't wait. Unlock your language learning potential now. Our Fake History listeners can grab Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Yeah, that's a lifetime membership. It's incredible. That's unlimited access to 25 language courses for life. Visit rosettastone.com/history to get started and claim your 50% off today. Go to rosettastone.com/history and start learning today. For centuries, knowledge of the Vinland colony was preserved in the Icelandic Sagas. But as you might expect, these texts were little known outside of Iceland and Scandinavia. It wasn't until the early 18th century that they were reappraised and championed as evidence for early Norse contact with North America. The first modern scholar to make this case was Thormod Torfason, an Icelander who eventually became the royal historian of Denmark and Norway. In 1705, he published his History of Ancient Vinland, which made the case that Vinland was real and was located somewhere in North America. Torfason's work was well read in the Scandinavian world, but remained fairly obscure elsewhere. It would take another 80 years before the idea started to gain some traction outside of Scandinavia and Iceland. In 1789, a translation of a work by a Swiss historian named Henri Mallet appeared in an American periodical called The American Museum. The two-part feature was titled An Account of the Discovery of Vinland or America by Icelanders. These articles essentially summarized the two relevant Vinland sagas and then ultimately concluded that, quote, there can be no doubt that Norwegian Greenlanders discovered the American continent, and that the place where they settled was either the country of Labrador or Newfoundland, end quote. This American Museum article did much to popularize ideas about Norse contact among the American intelligentsia. Benjamin Franklin was a known high-profile subscriber to the idea that the Norse had beat Columbus to the continent. Even Columbus's most consequential 19th century biographer, Washington Irving, felt compelled to address the evidence for early Scandinavian contact in the opening pages of 1828's The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, a book that has come up on this podcast before. But the idea didn't really break containment until 1837 and the publication of Antiquitates Americanae by the Danish philologist and historian Carl Christian Rafn. The book was a massive tome that assembled 18 medieval Icelandic documents. Rafn argued that these texts provided undeniable evidence that the Norse had not only made it to North America, but they had continued contact with the Vinland colony for decades and potentially centuries. The most important of these texts were the two Vinland Sagas, which were presented in their original Icelandic and also Danish and Latin translations. Significantly, the book also included an introductory abstract written in English, designed specifically to catch the attention of scholarly reviewers in England and the United States. This abstract summarized the Vinland Sagas and outlined Rafn's main argument. The Norse arrived in North America around the year 1000. From there, Rafn speculated about the modern geography of this place. He believed that Helluland, or Rock Slab Land, was northern Newfoundland, Markland was New Brunswick and Lower Canada, and Vinland was New England, specifically Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Now, these conclusions caught the attention of American reviewers, who did a lot to bring attention to what may have otherwise been a text read only by experts. This prompted Rafn to create a much shorter English-language summary of his work meant for a popular audience. The result was a 40-page booklet whose title, America Discovered in the 10th Century, got straight to the point. This much more accessible piece of writing sold well in the United States and effectively popularized the idea that the Norse had visited the continent 500 years before any other Europeans. But the 40-page America Discovered in the 10th Century was not nearly as scholarly as the weightier Antiquitates Americanae. In hopes of streamlining his argument, Rafn took some liberties with his summaries of the sagas. He smoothed over most of the narrative contradictions that existed between the two Vinland sagas. Instead, he presented a clean narrative that involved 3 distinct expeditions to Vinland. The first, led by Leif Erikson, the second, led by Thorvald Eriksson, and the final expedition, led by Thorfinn Karlsefni. All of the supernatural elements either went unmentioned in this summary or were greatly minimized. The character of Freydis was hugely diminished. Her killing spree gets a 1-sentence mention before Rafn promptly moves on. Her moment of badass breast-slapping glory was not mentioned at all. Rafn's summary made the descriptions of Vinland come across as far less cluttered and fantastical. If all you read was America Discovered in the 10th Century, and that was what most American readers had access to, then you were given the impression that the Icelandic sagas presented a very clear, specific, and uncomplicated narrative about the first attempts to colonize North America. But it didn't end there. Rafn's booklet then went on to explain his personal theories concerning the true location of Vinland. Focusing on the lines in the Saga of the Greenlanders that spoke about the length of the days and the warmth of the winter in Vinland, Rafn surmised that Vinland had to have been located in modern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, near Cape Cod. He proposed that the settlement that the Norse had called Stromfjord was now Martha's Vineyard. The southern Hope settlement he proposed was a spot near the modern border of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, called Mount Hope Bay. He went so far as to suggest, without very much evidence at all, that the name Hope had somehow been preserved by the region's indigenous people before being adopted by English settlers centuries later. Hope became Mount Hope Bay. But most important for Rafn, Massachusetts and Rhode Island are places where wild grapes are known to grow. Now, this theory seemed reasonable enough. But Rafn took it even further, suggesting that the Norse likely traveled even further south along the coasts of modern New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. These were fairly sensational claims. But Rafn did not simply rely on textual evidence. He also argued that there was physical evidence of the Viking presence in New England. Specifically, he pointed to two notorious New England curiosities, Dighton Rock and the Newport Tower. I think we can safely say that these two archaeological oddities are America's first fake, or at least misattributed, Viking artifacts. Now, you may have heard of Dighton Rock and the Newport Tower before, because many pseudo-historians have fixated on these unusual objects. Both Dighton Rock and the Newport Tower have been used as junk evidence for early American landings by the ancient Hebrews, the Phoenicians, Zheng He and his Ming-era Chinese sailors, the Portuguese, and, of course, a super advanced and super ancient lost Atlantis-like civilization. Dighton Rock is a glacial sandstone boulder that's engraved with a curious collection of markings. Rafn proposed that these markings were in fact an assemblage of Latin letters and Norse runes. He also believed that the name Thorfinn was clearly visible on the rock. Rafn also claimed that some of the pictographs on the rock were meant to represent Thorfinn, Gudrid, Snorri, and that pesky bellowing bull that constantly messed up Norse-Skraeling relations. Now, if you are curious what all of this stuff looks like, I will have pictures up on the website at ourfakehistory.com. I will also have pictures up on the Facebook page. The second piece of physical evidence, the Newport Tower, is a ruined stone tower that many have speculated predates the English settlement of Rhode Island. Rafn guessed that this tower was in fact the ruined remains of a Norse baptistry built either by Leif Erikson or Thorfinn Karlsefni. Now, I realize that I may need to return to both of these much-debated archaeological curios down the road on this podcast. There are a lot of wild theories about both of these objects. But for now, suffice it to say that Rafn's theories about both Dighton Rock and the Newport Tower have not held up well to scrutiny. Experts in Norse runes have since demonstrated that the markings on the rock are in no way consistent with any known runic writing system. It's now the opinion of the vast majority of scholars that the original carvings on Dighton Rock were put there by Algonquin-speaking indigenous people. The symbols and the pictographs on the rock are very closely related to other indigenous carvings found throughout New England and Vermont. The carvings on Dighton Rock were likely added to by European colonists who contributed their own graffiti over the centuries. Part of the reason Dighton Rock remains such a puzzle is because it's a mix of ancient Algonquin carvings and colonial-era European carvings. As for the Newport Tower, the best research has demonstrated that it is almost certainly the ruins of a windmill built by Rhode Island's first English governor, Benedict Arnold. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was the great-grandfather of the revolutionary turncoat of the same name. The first mention of the Newport Tower in any primary source comes from Arnold's will in 1677, where he calls it, quote, "my stone windmill," end quote. One 19th century researcher from Harvard also tracked down the windmill's original design, which was based on a windmill built in Warwick, England. That same researcher pointed out that it's notable that none of the early English settlers ever wrote anything about seeing such a remarkable stone structure when they first arrived in what would become Rhode Island. If the Newport Tower predated English settlement, then you would expect the early English settlers to marvel at the fact that, oh my God, there's a stone tower here. There's no other stone towers in this country. What went on here? Those sources do not exist. The reason they don't exist is because the tower was built by English colonists. But when Rafn made these claims about Dighton Rock and the Newport Tower in 1838, most readers took them at face value. It would take decades before they were challenged in any substantial way. Further, Rafn's arguments concerning a New England Vinland found a very receptive audience among, you guessed it, New Englanders. Expert Annette Kolodny has argued that 19th century Americans were openly jealous of the ancient and medieval past possessed by Europeans and romanticized in the then very popular works of Sir Walter Scott. Rafn's work gave Euro-Americans a much-desired medieval heritage. New Englanders, who had long vaunted the importance of the Plymouth colony as the start of the American project, now had an even more ancient pedigree. They weren't just the descendants of the Pilgrims, they were the descendants of the Vikings. This sentiment was rather poetically expressed by the New England novelist Sarah Orne Jewett. In 1886, she wrote wistfully about Leif Erikson's mistake in abandoning New England's Vinland, writing, quote, "Vinland waited hundreds of years after that for the hardy Icelanders' kindred to come from Old England to build their houses and live their lives upon its good corn land." End quote. In this new imaginary, Anglo-New Englanders were Leif Erikson's quote-unquote kindred, which gave them an even more ancient title to the land. In 1840, an anonymous contributor to the Massachusetts Quarterly Review exemplified how in just 2 short years, Rafn's ideas had deeply affected New Englanders' popular understanding of their history. Writing, quote, "The modern New England character has in it much more of the Norse than the Saxon," end quote. Like many of his fellow New Englanders, this writer was seeing all sorts of Viking-ish traits in the region's people, especially considering that, quote, "One of the most prominent features in the New England character is a talent for maritime affairs," end quote. The Vikings were good seafarers, and so were New Englanders. Therefore, it made perfect sense that the two peoples were connected by a lost history. He, like many New Englanders, started to see the region's 19th century culture as evidence that Vinland had to have been around Cape Cod. After the success of Rafn's booklet, his ideas were spread even further by the 19th century equivalent of podcasts. This was the popular lecture circuit, where both experts and amateurs traveled from city to city, giving public talks on everything from history to politics to religion to scientific discoveries. These lectures could be incredibly educational and edifying, but they were also loved by quacks, pseudoscientists, and all types of scammers. They really were the podcasts of the 19th century. The quote-unquote Norse discovery of North America made for excellent lecture fodder, and soon many historians, both professional and amateur, were touring the country, bringing more popular attention to Rafn's research. Soon, more books building on Rafn's work started to be published. That next wave of mostly amateur research pushed theories about the Norse in North America to new and preposterous places. Okay, this seems like a good place to pause and catch our breath. When we come back, we'll see how Rafn's American Vikings inspired some particularly grandiose historical fantasies. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Little Sleepies. So, some of you might know I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids, and man, when you first become a parent, there's a lot to learn. And one of the things that I had no idea about was children's clothing. People end up giving you a lot of hand-me-down clothes that may or may not work for your kid, and people seem to have lots of opinions about what kind of stuff your kid should be wearing. But when you find a company like Little Sleepies, it can make your life a whole lot easier. Little Sleepies makes children's clothes for bedtime and playtime, so your kids can stay stylish and comfy 24/7. The company was created by real moms who understand the realities of daily life with kids. The clothes are made with super soft, comfortable fabrics that actually hold up, and they fit 3 times longer than other brands. On top of that, the thoughtful details in these clothes make everyday dressing and diaper changing a breeze. If you're expecting or dressing little ones, then check out Little Sleepies. You can visit littlesleepies.com and use promo code GOODNIGHT, that's all caps, GOODNIGHT, for 10% off your first order. One of the more bold suggestions to emerge from Carl Christian Rafn's America Discovered in the 10th Century was that the Norse and potentially the Irish may have created an 11th century settlement south of where he placed the Vinland colony. According to Rafn, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida may have been a place called Kvitra Manaland. And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that exactly right, but hey, by this point, I think the Scandinavians have just accepted that it's going to be what it's going to be. This place is mentioned very briefly in the saga of Eric the Red, and in that saga, the Norse do not ever visit it. The saga tells us that a group of Skraelings were captured in Markland during Thorfinn Karlsefni's return journey to Greenland. These captives eventually learned enough Norse to communicate with their captors. The saga tells us that these folks spoke of a country adjacent to their own, where the people, quote, dressed in white garments, uttered loud cries, bore long poles, and wore fringes. Because of these white costumes, this place became known as Kvitra-Manaland, which translates roughly as white man's land. So, at most, the saga of Eric the Red suggests that a group of people who wore white clothes lived near Markland, which by all accounts was north of Vinland, most likely modern Labrador. But Carl Rafn believed that these people didn't just have light clothes, they must also have light skin. He combined that scrap from the saga of Eric the Red with a story from a completely different Icelandic saga. This is the Eyrbyggja saga. In that text, there's a story about a group of Icelanders who are driven out to sea while trying to sail from Dublin to Iceland. They eventually encounter a previously unidentified land that was inhabited by a large community of Irish people. Eventually, these two stories were conflated in the late medieval period. that mysterious settlement of Irish people visited by the Norse started to be called Kvitramanaland in some medieval Icelandic sources. For a handful of medieval Icelandic chroniclers, this place where people wore white clothes and waved around big sticks was assumed to have been the same place as this legendary Western Irish settlement. Now, like many things in the sagas, this entire encounter between the Norse and these, let's call them Western Irish, may have been entirely fictional. Ireland has a long folklore tradition about mythical Western islands. Often, these places were described as fair and filled with grapes and wine. But Rafn boldly suggested that this place was just as well attested to as Vinland in the sagas. And he went a step further. He thought that this place was in the southern United States. Now, you might imagine how some folks reacted when they read that the American South may have had an ancient history as white man's land. You can probably guess where this is going. This idea found a particularly enthusiastic supporter in William Gilmore Simms, one of the American South's most popular novelists and writer of historical romances in the 19th century. Simms was well known for his novels set in South Carolina during the American Revolutionary War, like the very popular 1835 novel The Partisan. But he's also been remembered as a loud and unwavering supporter of American slavery. He was one of the most high-profile literary critics to pan Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous abolitionist novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. In fact, his 1854 novel, The Sword and the Distaff, was written as a direct response to Harriet Beecher Stowe and was overtly pro-slavery. Simms even had the audacity to name his cheerfully enslaved character Tom. So, given that context, it should perhaps come as no surprise that William Gilmore Simms was drawn to the idea that the Carolinas and Georgia had not only been visited by the Vikings, but had a deep history as the so-called white man's land. In 1841, Simms published an article in the Southern literary magazine The Magnolia titled The Discoveries of the Northmen. The article drew heavily on the work of Carl Christian Rafn, but looked more specifically at its implications for the American South. Simms was also influenced by the work of an Irish writer named North Ludlow Beamish, who believed that Rafn's research had given greater credence to the existence of a Western Irish settlement, sometimes called Great Ireland. Beamish argued that Irish exploration traditions had been suppressed by the English colonizers, and he had a point. This meant that he was willing to engage with tales that had previously been written off as purely legendary. Did he give those tales a bit too much credence? Well, I'll let you decide. The story of the Norse meeting an Irish community in some unidentified western land in the Icelandic Saga was pointed to as proof that Great Ireland had been a real place. Simms then put all of this together into an elaborate story about the American South. Combining the work of Rafn and Beamish, Simms proposed that the southern United States was both Great Ireland and Kvitramanaland, the white man's land. Simms then added to the mix what he claimed was an indigenous tradition. According to him, the first people of Georgia and the Carolinas had a tradition that their ancestors had migrated from the Southwest and had found these coastal territories already inhabited. Simms wrote, quote, The tradition of our Indians was that they had come from the southwest and destroyed a civilized and superior people, a white people who used iron instruments. End quote. Now, Sims didn't personally invent this particular tale as it was circulating widely in the South at the time, but you need to understand that this was absolutely not a real indigenous tradition. This is fake indigenous history. We now know that this story is not part of any oral historical or mythical tradition preserved by the region's first people. But in 1841, it was widely accepted as an authentic myth. Now, Sims put all of these pieces together into a grand pseudo-history for the South. In his telling, the story from the Icelandic Saga of the Norse encountering a country filled with Irish settlers reflected a real encounter that took place in the Carolinas. Further, he insisted that when these Irish settlers and their Norse visitors got to this country, they found it uninhabited. According to Sims, there were no Skraelings in this place. That meant that these Europeans were the true first people of Georgia and the Carolinas, and in fact, most of the American South. From there, he speculated that a hybrid Norse-Irish culture flourished in this place and built all the ancient structures and monuments that he felt could not have possibly been constructed by the country's true indigenous people. This included the sacred mounds that are found throughout the American South and Midwest. For Sims, a lost group of white people from this white man's land were the true architects of these impressive structures. Then, sometime before 1492, this Norse-Irish society was overwhelmed by invaders from the southwest. Sims summed up this Nordic-themed antebellum fairy tale like this. And be warned, Sims uses some predictably anti-indigenous language and rhetoric here. Quote, "A judicious artist would make a most romantic tale of the colony of Green Erin on the shores of Carolina and Georgia, showing how, driven by the stress of weather and finding so lovely a land, greener than their own beloved island, they pitched their tents for good, how they built cities, how they flourished among songs and dances. Suddenly, the fierce red men of the southwest came down upon them in howling thousands, captured their women, slaughtered their men, and drove them to their fortresses. How they fought to the last and perished to a man. And in this history, you have the history of the tumuli, those are the sacred mounds, by the way, and the works of defense and worship, the 1,000 proofs with which our land is covered of a genius and an industry immeasurably superior to anything that the Indian inhabitants of this country ever attempted." End quote. Whew. In that passage, you can really hear how Sims' prejudices direct his thinking. He did not believe that indigenous people could have possibly been behind great works of architecture, so he was willing to use whatever scraps he could find from the sagas and Irish tradition that could help him resolve the cognitive dissonance. This version of the Southern past also served a very specific political purpose in the early 1840s. When Sims' article was published in 1841, Georgia had just been through a decade that saw the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people. This brutal chapter of history has become better known as the Trail of Tears. With that context in mind, you could see how a version of the Southern past that proposed that the Cherokee and the Choctaw had less claim to the land than light-skinned Europeans might find some receptive ears among those in power. Unfortunately, these ideas were not contained to just one article. Sims' fantastical elaboration on the work of Christian Rafn would go on to be hugely influential. Sims would eventually write a history textbook that was used in Southern Carolina classrooms in the mid-19th century. That book presented Norse contact and stories about Great Ireland as a key part of the state's prehistory. The book even contained questions for students like, quote, "What was the tradition of the Northmen as the inhabitants of this region?" And, quote, "To what race are we to ascribe the ancient remains of this country?" End quote. The implied answers were that light-skinned Europeans got to South Carolina first and did everything of value in that state. Sims' fanciful pseudo-history of the South was literally taught in classrooms. So, in just a few years, the real evidence for Norse contact in North America, as presented in the work of Carl Christian Rafn, had birthed an entire subgenre of fake Viking history. It couldn't be that the Norse explorers had made brief contact with Newfoundland and eastern Canada. No, Leif Erikson was in fact the forefather of all New Englanders, and the Vikings had secretly been the true first people of the American South. Once these narratives were set loose, soon more and more physical artifacts started appearing to support them. For instance, in 1838, a strange runestone was found at an archaeological dig at the Grave Creek Mound in what was then Virginia, now West Virginia. The markings on this artifact were identified by some as Norse runes. Others thought they might be Hebrew or Phoenician. It was only in 2008 that this stone was convincingly shown to be a hoax. The inscriptions were clearly all copied from an 18th century collection called An Essay on the Alphabets of the Unknown Letters that are found in the most ancient coins and monuments of Spain. The fake runestone was likely planted by a local physician who had financed the excavation of the mound. Now, why plant a fake runestone? Because it would make it look like the mounds were not built by indigenous people. Over the next century, dozens of faux Viking objects were found all over the United States. Many turned up in Oklahoma, including the Heavener runestone, the Poitou runestone, the Shawnee runestone, and the Braxton County runestone. All of these have been shown to be 19th or 20th century forgeries. Now, you would think that by virtue of the fact that all of these stones were found in Oklahoma, that would immediately make them suspect. But the reason that some folks were fooled was because they fit within the pseudo-historical narrative that had been laid out in 1841 by William Sims. These were faked artifacts that helped give credence to the fictional white man's land. Now, to be clear, not every fake was inspired by this elaborate pseudo-history. Some of them seem to be about getting a small town some attention. And some of these forgeries were fairly ridiculous. For instance, in 1923, a runic inscription was found in Brooklyn, New York, that translated in modern Swedish as, quote, "Leif Erikson was here," end quote. A quick look by the experts quickly confirmed that the runes were not medieval. Then, in 1952, there was much excitement when a rune-inscribed drinking horn was discovered buried in Waukegan, Illinois. That drinking horn was inscribed with the date 1317. Could the horn have been corroboratory evidence for the authenticity of the Kensington runestone, which was also dated to the 14th century? No. It was soon determined that the drinking horn was a 20th century knickknack that had been sold in a tourist shop in Iceland. Now, this is just a small sampling of the long tradition of fake archaeological finds inspired by the Norse. Believe me, there are many more. But I think it's time that we finally looked in detail at the real archaeological finds. You see, Rafn, Sims, and a fleet of romantic New Englanders and proud Scandinavian immigrants may have been overzealous in their interpretations of the sagas. But that does not mean that the sagas do not contain grains of historical truth. What has the best archaeology told us about the extent of the Norse travels? And does it align with the medieval Icelandic texts? Let's take one more break, and when we come back, we'll get into it. For well over a century, the medieval Norse lived in a strange spot in the North American historical imagination. From the 1830s onward, most history buffs were familiar with the theory that Leif Erikson and a handful of other Norse explorers had arrived in North America in the early medieval period. However, the theory remained stubbornly unproven. The proliferation of Viking fakes and forgeries certainly had the effect of bringing popular attention to ideas about Norse contact, but when those objects were ultimately debunked, it pushed research into American Vikings towards the fringe. Norse settlements in North America became a pet obsession for a certain brand of pseudo-historian and pseudo-archaeologist, some of whom were inspired by William Gilmore Simms, to prove the existence of a southern white man's land. But in the 1960s, research into the Norse voyages west of Greenland was reinvigorated, and in many ways legitimized by the work of a Norwegian husband and wife team. This was Helga and Anne Steen Ingstad. By 1960, Helge Ingstad was already a famous person, especially in his home country of Norway. He had made a career as an adventurer and an author, penning popular books about his visits to some of the most remote parts of the planet. Anne Steen was a trained archaeologist who started collaborating with her husband soon after their marriage in 1941. She helped bring a new level of scientific rigor to their work. Like many, Anne and Helga had long believed that the stories found in the Vinland sagas likely contained a grain of historical truth. The Ingstads had both spent long stretches in Greenland and had become deeply familiar with the medieval Norse ruins in that country. They guessed that if there was any evidence of a Norse presence in North America, it would likely be found close to Greenland, rather than in Massachusetts, Minnesota, or South Carolina. So in 1960, they set out on an expedition in a small government medical boat along the coast of Newfoundland, using their knowledge of the Greenland settlements as a guide for their explorations. The sagas were certainly consulted, but the Ingstads recognized that the text's contradictory accounts could sometimes be more of a hindrance than a help. Sure enough, in the fall of that year, they came to a small community in the northernmost part of Newfoundland. At the time, there were no roads that went to the sparsely populated fishing village near Lanceau Meadows. Like many remote Newfoundland communities, it was water access only. But almost immediately, the site caught the Ingstad's interest. Helga Ingstad would later remember, quote, "It was not only that Lanso Meadows was situated on the north coast, but I also remember that when we sailed past it, I had noticed the open, inviting, verdant countryside. And I thought of meadows, which is the same as grasslands, or the Old Norse vin, just what the Norsemen were looking for." End quote. Perhaps Vinland had actually meant meadowland. Further, the spot was at the end of a long bay and had a nearby freshwater stream. The Ingstads knew from their research in Greenland that these types of locations were often favored by the Norse in that country. After coming ashore and asking around, a local Newfoundlander named George Decker pointed the Norwegian couple to a place where he knew that there were some ruins. Who built these ruins? He had no idea, but he had always known that they were there. These were small grassy mounds that seemed to have grown over the foundations of some very old buildings. Anne and Helga Ingstad almost immediately saw the similarities between this site and the sites they'd become familiar with in Greenland. Then came the excavations. Over the course of the next 8 years, Anne Steen Ingstad led 7 archaeological excavations with the cooperation of the Government of Canada and the province of Newfoundland. Then a second round of excavations took place around a decade later, the first being led by Bent Schoenbach from 1973 to 1975, and the final being led by Birgitte Wallace in 1976. The initial Ingstad excavations proved definitively that the site was built by medieval Norse people. There had been 8 or 9 buildings at the site that were constructed in the same manner as the homes that the Norse built in Greenland. Most significantly, the Ingstads found the remains of a forge for smelting bog iron. Now, this was significant because this was a technology that was possessed by the Norse that was not possessed by the indigenous people of Newfoundland. At the site, iron nails were found, along with a soapstone spindle whorl that would have been used for spinning yarn, and a bronze ring pin that would have been used for fastening a cloak. The spindle whorl and the pin were both distinctively Norse. The design of the pin also reflected the Irish influence on medieval Norse culture at that time. Carbon dating of this site placed its construction somewhere between the years 990 and 1050 AD, or CE, whichever you like. That made the site perfectly consistent with the dates of the Vinland expeditions as recorded in the sagas. For the Ingstads, the discoveries at Lanso Meadows more or less settled the Vinland controversy. The evidence showed that the Norse were in Newfoundland. Therefore, Newfoundland was Vinland. As I quoted earlier, Helga Ingstad believed that the name Vinland had originally referred to meadowland and not a wine land. Lanso Meadows in northern Newfoundland is a pleasantly grassy spot. Perhaps it was possible that the saga writers heard the name Vinland, which was originally named for this grassy place, and incorrectly took it to mean land of wine. From there, perhaps, they inserted the tales of the wild grapes. Saga expert Herman Paulsen has offered that the Vinland accounts may have been influenced by, quote, Irish tales of Atlantic voyages and wine lands or wine islands that were supposed to be somewhere far away in the ocean, end quote. So, this line of thinking goes that the Norse only ever voyaged as far as Newfoundland and Labrador. The name Vinland was given to northern Newfoundland and was only ever meant to mean meadowland. The stories about wild grapes, frostless winters, and seasonally consistent day lengths were exaggerations influenced by Irish legends that were added to the sagas at some point in their transition from oral to written sources. The provincial government of Newfoundland and Labrador has always been particularly fond of this interpretation. Like the New Englanders before them, they have fully embraced the cachet that comes from being the historical Vinland. But this is not the only perspective. In fact, this interpretation has been steadily losing favor among the experts. The interpretation with the most support now has been best articulated by the Swedish-Canadian archaeologist Birgitta Wallace. Wallace led the 1976 excavation of the Lanso Meadows site and worked as an archaeologist with Parks Canada for decades. She believed that a few key pieces of evidence suggested that the sagas may have been more accurate than even the Ingstads were ready to accept. As we learned in the first two parts of our series, our two Vinland sagas presented us with two different geographies of Vinland. In the saga of the Greenlanders, we're told that there was only ever one main settlement in Vinland, known as Leif's Houses. But in the saga of Eric the Red, we're told that there were two settlements, a northern settlement named Stromfjord and a southern settlement called Hope. Wallace reminds us that in the saga of Eric the Red, quote, Stromfjord is a year-round settlement from which expeditions were launched in the summer, and to which everyone returned in the winter. No grapes grew there. Hope is the land used in the summer in southern Vinland, where the Norse cut lumber. It is a wonderful place where there is self-sown wheat and grapes grow wild. Hope is named for its river lagoons and tidal estuaries inside sand barriers so shallow that ships could only enter at high tide. End quote. Wallace argues that the account in the saga of the Greenlanders may have conflated these two distinct Vinland settlements. She points out that the Leif's Houses settlement in the saga of the Greenlanders, quote, physical description is close to that of Hope, but its function is that of Stromfjord, end quote. The excavations at Lanso Meadows demonstrated that the settlement only ever sustained a small population, as few as 30 and as many as 160 people. The physical evidence also makes it clear that it was a ship repair site. It shares many characteristics with other medieval ship repair sites found around Scandinavia and Iceland. Then there was the most unexpected piece of evidence. The excavations unearthed the used shells of butternuts. Butternuts are a specific type of white walnut that the medieval inhabitants of this site had eaten at one point. Now, why are the butternuts so important? Because butternuts have never grown in Newfoundland. The butternuts had to have been collected from someplace further south and then brought to Lanso Meadows. Yes, after all this, the butternuts are the key piece of the puzzle. The presence of the butternut shells strongly suggests that Lanso Meadows was not the last stop on the Norse voyage west. Wallace proposes that Lanso Meadows was likely Stromfjord, or a Stromfjord-like place that acted as a key staging area for further Norse explorations. Or, as Wallace puts it, quote, a base camp for future exploration and exploitation of new resources for the Greenland settlement, a gateway to Vinland, where lumber, grapes, and other riches were collected, end quote. Now, to be clear, Lanso Meadows is not a picture-perfect match with the descriptions of Stromfjord found in the sagas, but it's close. It's not really at the end of a fjord, but it is tucked into a bay near a large island, which could have been the saga's Strom Isle. You might recall that the saga of Eric the Red tells us that Stromfjord was only occupied for around 3 years. The archaeological evidence at Lanso Meadows aligns with that. There are no known burial sites at Lanso Meadows, which suggests that it was only occupied for a very short period of time. Further evidence comes from that iron forge that I mentioned earlier. According to Parks Canada, quote, "The amount and type of iron slag found suggests that a single smelt took place. Very little iron was manufactured, only enough for making about 100 to 200 nails." End quote. The assumption is that if the Norse had been there longer than a few years, they would have fired up the forge more than just one time. So, if Lanso Meadows was Stromfjord, then where was Hope? Birgitta Wallace proposes that it was near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, specifically what is today the Gaspé Peninsula and northeastern New Brunswick, potentially Chaleur Bay or the Miramichi area. Now, why these spots? Well, first, if we assume that Lanso Meadows was the Stromfjord-like jumping-off site for the Norse, it would have only taken a few days of sailing southwest to arrive in northern New Brunswick. Now, as we discussed, the sagas are not very specific when it comes to the lengths of the sea voyages undertaken by the various expeditions to Vinland. But they do seem to suggest that Markland was a few days sailing from Helluland and Vinland was a few days sailing from Markland. If Hope Vinland was in northern New Brunswick, it would be consistent with those descriptions. Next, northeastern New Brunswick is a place with tidal estuaries consistent with the descriptions in the saga of Eric the Red. On top of that, northeastern New Brunswick and the St. Lawrence River Valley are places where butternuts, and even more significantly, wild grapes, were known to grow. For a long time, American Viking enthusiasts worked off the assumption that wild grapes did not grow any further north than Massachusetts. But this is not so. There's evidence that wild grapes have grown in New Brunswick for well over 1,000 years. The other key piece of evidence that suggests that this part of what is today eastern Canada may have been Vinland are the descriptions of the Skraelings from the sagas. As I've mentioned a number of times throughout this series, there are many things about the Vinland Skraelings that make them sound a lot like the Algonquin-speaking First People of Canada's east coast. Birgitta Wallace believes that the Vinland Skraelings were, in fact, the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq people. As we've discussed, the Vinland Skraelings of the sagas engaged in both trade and war in ways that sound consistent with Algonquin and Mi'kmaq cultures. Now, I should have mentioned this when we were going through the saga of Eric the Red, but, to be fair, there was a lot to get through. But in the description of the battle between the Skraelings and the Norse, we're told that the Skraelings employed a catapult-like device. Interestingly, we know that ancient Algonquin-speaking peoples had a similar weapon. Then there are the watercraft. You might remember that the sagas contain many descriptions of the Skraelings going about in small vessels that the Norse call skin boats. We know that the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq people used canoes made from moose and deer hides during the proto-historical period. These moose hide canoes may have reminded the Norse of Scandinavian skin boats, which were similarly constructed. Further, Wallace has pointed out that examples of these types of canoes from the proto-historical period are rarely found south of what is today central Maine. In other words, because moosehide canoes were more common further north, this places Vinland more firmly in what is today Canada. In my humble opinion, Wallace has made a fairly persuasive case that L'Anse aux Meadows was Stromfjord and northern New Brunswick was Hope. Vinland was Atlantic Canada. Now, it should be noted that while this is a good hypothesis, there's still no physical evidence that confirms the southernmost extent of the Viking voyages. We may still learn more. In fact, most experts keep the door open for the potential of a more southerly Hope. For instance, the expert Gisli Sigurdsson agrees with Wallace that New Brunswick's Miramichi area has all the, quote, Vinlandian delicacies, end quote. But he points out that many places further south also have things like butternuts and wild grapes. So, it seems to me that Birgitta Wallace gives us the best possible guess as to exactly how far the Vikings voyaged. The physical evidence takes us only as far as Newfoundland, but the butternuts prove that the Norse were at least voyaging to southern latitudes where that specific type of walnut grows. That place begins around the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and the northern banks of New Brunswick. That means for all their supernatural weirdness and allegorical storytelling tropes, the sagas managed to preserve many historical truths. The sagas communicate a truth that the Norse people arrived in North America around the year 1000. They established settlements, collected resources, smelted some iron, traded, and fought with the local people. Then, after only a few years, they left. If they returned again, it was in such a small way that their presence did not leave enough of a physical impression to survive the centuries. Those are the truths. The specific details, as they are recorded in the sagas, remain up for debate. One of the things that strikes me about the search for Vinland is how fake history can sometimes swallow and potentially ruin real history. The work of Carl Christian Rafn did much to bring attention to the Icelandic Sagas, but his use of sketchy evidence to place Vinland in New England nearly undid any of the good work he had done by translating the medieval texts. The wave of bogus Viking artifacts and the enthusiasm for the American Vikings from slavery apologists and other unsavory characters obscured the honest examination of Norse exploration with a fog of pseudo-history. In the world of music, there's a cliche that sometimes you can like a band but hate their fans. When I look at the discourse around the American Vikings, especially in the 1800s, that's how I feel. I like the Vikings, but I'm not so sure about their 19th century fans. Thankfully, the work of real archaeologists and historians has done much to set the record straight. A genuine curiosity about the extent of the Norse voyages, less romantically attached to the borders of the modern United States, eventually brought seekers further north and closer to Greenland. The work of forgers and fantasists nearly made the study of Norse contact into a purely fringe pursuit. But thankfully, we did not throw baby Snorri out with the bogus bathwater. We found the Vikings, perched humbly on the northern tip of Newfoundland, and our understanding of world history has been deeper and better for it. All that's left now is to argue about the butternuts. Oh, Okay, that's all for this week. Join me again in just 1 week's time when I will be answering your questions about this series on the Vikings. If you've got questions for me, please send them to ourfakehistory@gmail.com. And if you're a patron, then please go to the chat area and plop your questions into the chat. I tend to privilege the questions sent by the patrons, but if there's something on your mind, don't be afraid to send me an email. Before we go this week, I also want to give a shout out to Parks Canada and the Parks Canada Recollections podcast, hosted by my old public history classmate, Angela Duffett. They do amazing work over there at the Parks Canada podcast, and they've done an awesome episode on Lanceau Meadows in northern Newfoundland. So if you want to learn more, check out the Recollections podcast, brought to you by Parks Canada. Also, before we sign off, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Demon Fall Down, to Glenn B, to Jet, to MJ Henkels, and to Bye Phoenicia. That's good. I love the joke names. Keep the joke names coming. These folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. If you want to join up on Patreon, head to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Find a level of support that works for you. There's also other ways you can support us. You can go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links to our merch store. All the merch is created by the amazing Frank Fiorentino, who does all the artwork for our show. While you're at ourfakehistory.com, feel free to take a look at the bibliographies I put up for every single show. If you're curious about the sources that I use, I always list them there. You can also follow this show on social media. We are on Instagram at Our Fake History. We are on Facebook, facebook.com/OurFakeHistory. We are on TikTok at Our Fake History. We are on YouTube. Just search for Our Fake History. Every week I am putting up fun, short little videos that hopefully get people excited about the most recent audio podcast. As always, the theme music comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. And remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
TV has thousands of free movies and TV shows.
You swear?
If I'm lying, I'm dying.
This is the mindset.
Free.
This is the mantra.
Free.
This is the mindset.
With movies like Interstellar, Dreamgirls, and Gladiator.
Are you not entertained?
And TV shows like Survivor, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Fairly Odd Parents, and Ghosts. Pluto TV is always free.
Huzzah!
Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.